Okay, hey everybody, and welcome back to the Restart Pod. It's going to be just Shashi and I today, as Lakshay is on some much-needed vacation, if we can call it that. I think he's trying to camp, also trying to get Starlink to work so he can work. So we'll catch him next time. But we've been kind of kicking around some ideas in the chat back and forth with respect to AI growth, AI hypergrowth, AI profitability in the model companies specifically, whether it be OpenAI or Anthropic or where Google as an incumbent slots into there. So I think I'll tee you up here, Shashi, to give kind of a prelude. I think we'll have an interesting discussion maybe from different sides here. So why don't you go first, kind of outline what you think, how you kind of see the landscape shaping up?
Yeah, I think we've been in a growth at all costs mode, and I think it's made sense for the most part. I think 90% of that has made sense. There is an important aspect of sentiment, and I just want to highlight that sentiment in markets can shift. We haven't seen that shift in a while. We've had relatively cheap cost of capital, and that isn't always the case. And so we could potentially see a shift from the growth orientation, starting with the hyperscalers, the model labs have been investing a huge amount of money on pure growth, and their venture dollars are subsidizing the tokenomics of their users. They spend more money on generating tokens than they do in returning revenue from those tokens. And that for now has made sense, and their valuations continue to rise, justifying that subsidization of tokens. But that doesn't mean it's always going to be the case. And I want to highlight that that's a possibility and worth us making some space for, and understanding that sentiment shift could come. One possible way it could come, Gary Marcus highlighted recently that he had a hot take in which he thought OpenAI will potentially struggle as tokenomics and token maxing. So we've seen companies essentially measuring token use as a KPI for their employees, meaning the more tokens you use, the better. And that hasn't always proved to have good ROI for the customers. And so some of those customers are reassessing and reevaluating how much return the company is getting from all of those tokens spent. And CFOs are now starting to scrutinize that spend a little bit more than they were before. If that were to continue, if that trend were to continue, you might see token use or model selection, meaning you might move down a model. Instead of using the most frontier model, you might bump down to a Sonnet or a 4.6 or a 4.7. Now that 4.8 is out, you might see companies opt for a slightly cheaper model in order to be more economical with their token use. If that were to happen, if the end customer of tokens are starting to consider the ROI, then all of a sudden now we start having an impetus to potentially shift. And that shift could take the form of OpenAI and Anthropic, the two companies who are most subsidizing the tokens, reassessing how much they want to maximize data center growth. Gary Marcus also suggests that Google will catch up to Anthropic. Google's in a position in which they kind of compete with everybody on everything. They're competing with the frontier models on models. They're competing with AWS and with Azure on cloud. They compete with all of the big boys basically on everything. And Google can subsidize. Google can subsidize tokens because they have revenue and profit in a way that Anthropic and OpenAI don't. So I'll just pause there, Damon, give you a chance to respond.
Yeah, for the most part, I agree with essentially all of that. I mean, I think the unidentified risk, if I can distill it down to kind of the most core argument, is providing intelligence a viable business model? We don't have the answer to that yet, right? Like to your point, these companies in hypergrowth phase have been subsidizing costs. Like recorded reports are as much as a single $200 per month Claude subscription may cost Anthropic as much as like $2,000, maybe even $5,000, right? So they're kind of like 10x, losers in that space. Now, that said, that includes the price of training, right? We also have reports that Anthropic just had a profitable quarter. So in many ways, those two ideas don't necessarily they're not cohesive, right? They're kind of in conflict. So one of those two things can be true, but not necessarily both of them, or at least not both of them to a significant degree. Candidly, I think we will see a profitable quarter from Anthropic, but I think going forward we will not, because they're going to ramp compute spend, right? Anthropic relative to the other guys, to Google, as you outlined, to OpenAI, certainly have been much more conservative in their forward projected compute spend, mostly because they were only serving enterprise customers for the large part, right? They have their user kind of consumer subscription, but it's a much smaller fraction of their business compared to somebody like OpenAI. So I think circling back, the core unanswered question and the reason for why these companies, specifically the OpenAI and the Anthropics of the world, could fail or struggle to grow beyond the valuations we're seeing at them right now, is if providing tokens in the form that we kind of currently think about them, if that looks more like airlines than it does like cloud services, then they're going to struggle down that singular line of business to outgrow roughly $1 trillion in valuation. I think the opposite side of that is that stagnation of growth assumes basically no change on any number of up to several factors, 5 in which we can itemize. Number one, it assumes that the frontier remains stagnant. So we've talked about this before, but unlike other technologies, the opportunity cost of not being on the frontier for other businesses that rely on these services, whether it be client service businesses, whether it be startups, whether it be research firms, hedge funds, etc., using an inferior model actually leads to a worse business and therefore an inferior competitive product to other competitors in your space, right? Like if you're a law firm, you can't use the second best Harvey model because that means your counterpart using the first best model and you're underserving your clients, right? And there are several replicates of that. Similarly, if you're in healthcare, you can't use the second best health model. If you're a consumer and you're talking these things in a chat interface, then absolutely, you can be cost optimizing. That's certainly true. On your CFO and token maxing point, you're right. We probably did hit peak token maxing. It's hard for me to recognize any other reality than that is peaked and coming down. That said, CFOs have been rewarded in the public markets for their emphasis on AI more so than they actually spent. The dollars do paper out in terms of material valuation value. The company gets a bump in the public markets because they're leaning in on AI. Yes, their spend in AI goes up. So the ROI isn't realized directly, but is realized through absolute valuation in terms of company. Now, that said, I do think you still have to right size at the bottom line, meaning you can't just spend endlessly on tokens. I think, unfortunately, the way you're going to see that in the near term is job cuts and reasonable per employee limits, I think, on tokens. The other thing with respect to the data centers, and I think the strongest argument for why this isn't a bubble, candidly, is that we are still supply constrained. So all these companies are in hypergrowth and those venture dollars are backing the hypergrowth. What they're not doing is subsidizing demand. And in previous bubble cycles that we've seen, whether it be the internet, housing, whatever, all of the subsidies that were artificial in nature were going to the demand side. Right now, this entire industry, and again, leaving physical AI, leaving robotics aside for the moment, the entire industry, even in the LLM world, just isolating on that singular component, is compute constrained. It is supply constrained in a way that makes Anthropic slow roll Mythos, in a way that makes them ramp up compute. It makes them rent an entire Colossus cluster from XAI right now SpaceX, these kind of things. And so I think the strongest counterpoint to the bubble is simply that right now we're supply constrained. And if that were to change, I think that's the strongest indicator that yes, prices are shaky, I think, at best. And then again, we can dive into kind of where these things expand into if we want to really pontificate around physical AI or data centers in space and kind of all these other things. But like just taking SpaceX on their word, they cited a $28 trillion TAM for the enterprise AI applications. Say they're an order of magnitude off, and you're still looking at a $2 trillion TAM here. So a $1 or $2 trillion company is certainly reasonable down a single revenue line.
Yeah, I would say the big risk is that these models become commodities, and the world is better. Let's start with we are absolutely in a better world today with intelligent models than we were before intelligent models. There's no doubt about that. More can get done by more people, and that's a net productivity gain for society. The risk is that these models aren't really differentiated for the most part, and most of the value can be accrued with very little token cost at some point here in the near future. I agree with all the assessments that you've made, that a CFO of a public company, they've been rewarded by token maxing. But at some point when the vibe shifts to hey, wait a minute, are we ever going to make an ROI on these tokens? Then all of a sudden, and I'm starting to see that now, and that's why I'm highlighting that that we may be at an inflection in which people start to look at the ROI and the long-term profit generation. And if that happens, then we may be in a place where a lot of value can be extracted from these models without going to the most expensive, most state-of-the-art model. And if that starts to happen, if the 4.7s of the world deliver most of the value that most people need, then the cost of tokens won't necessarily increase, and the open source models will have a chance to really catch up. Let's move to employment as a next topic, Damon. So one of the impacts we're seeing is that junior developers are less necessary, as senior developers can just get way more done using an army of agents. How do you see that playing out in the job market?
Yeah, it's interesting and it's apropos. I mean, I don't know if you saw that, there's been commencement speeches, mentioning AI and kind of being obviously poorly received, boot off of stage in some cases, with the co-founder of Google. I think the argument to me breaks down in kind of two different buckets. There's the junior and entry level workers, which to me does feel very tenuous at the moment. Like, you simply don't need to hire as many, to this point, junior engineers, but I think it also extrapolates out to junior analysts, junior interns, down various passive knowledge work, junior screenwriters in production for that matter. So basically junior anything, in my opinion, does feel a little bit under attack by these models a bit. That said, everybody I know who is actually using these models is working more, not less. Like, yes, they're commanding an army of agents, but what that means is they're periodically checking their phone every 10 minutes, checking in with that network of agents, prompting them for their next task, right, or approving the work product they just delivered, right, whether that's code or a document or otherwise. So on a individual by individual basis, I think you certainly have Javin's paradox, in which as the cost of intelligence goes down, as the cost of launching multiple agents goes down, the actual amount of hours worked is skyrocketing, right? And this is kind of like proving out across all of the anecdotes that I can pull from, myself included. That said, whereas I used to delegate work, I now no longer have to. I don't have to recruit, an intern or my associate to do a task. I spin up an agent for that. So I don't exactly know how to square those two ideas, meaning, like, if every single person is working more, at some point that has to reach a maximum, in which case that work then gets redelegated, right? But what you're doing is you're training the junior or the whatever, analyst, developer, etc., to command their own army of agents. You're not actually teaching them the core skills. So in my, I guess, most succinct delivery of this, I think we're adding a layer of abstraction that will take some growing pains to get through until we relearn how to train the next level of junior employees at a lot of these firms. Because junior work is going to look very different in a year than it did in October of last year.
In my conversations with my age cohort, which is mid-40s, fairly established in a career path and ingrained in a workflow, even the people who are the most technical in these large organizations are just now getting access to things like Claude. And so we live in this bubble. Those of us who live in kind of AI, Twitterverse, live in this bubble where we think absolutely everyone is using these tools. And in fact, the technology diffusion into society is still in the early phases. So a lot of these senior folks are just starting to get access to Claude, as an example. And so in this world, in this job market that we are in, someone who wants to play a role in this market can absolutely create a valuable role for themselves by learning the technologies. And I would encourage anyone who's in that position, who's early career, out of school, looking to make an impact in an industry, learn all the tools. First, understand all the tools available in the space. Understand the major tasks and workflows that often happen. And you can prompt any of these models, prompt Gemini, prompt Claude, prompt ChatGPT for these. Understand the important workflows and understand where technology is and isn't being used, and ask and prompt for the most realistic use cases. Because a lot of these large firms, large law firms, large financial firms, they simply are not in a position where they have internal talent that can make these technology shifts internally. And so they're going to look to you. They're going to need you to join their team and help walk them through how to transition their current workflow from its much more manual process to a technology-enabled one. It's not going to shift from purely human to purely technology. That's just unrealistic. I've not seen it once. But what can happen is that every one of those points is a potential candidate for optimization using agents to partner with humans. And that is very nuanced. It's context specific for each of those workflow steps. And taking the time, you should be the one who takes the time to learn the workflow and learn how to smartly integrate humans and technology to optimize for the goals of the organization. If you can be that person, you'll be an incredibly valuable resource, and you'll be someone that every firm in that industry wants to hire. And I would just go one step further and say, get specific about what you want. The more specific you can be about what kinds of firms you want to be involved in, what industries, the better, because then you can get to know the nuance of that industry better.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. I mean, number one, I think that the encouragement for the youngest cohort of anybody, and frankly anybody that has a significant career timeline ahead of them, needs to learn these tools, because I think regardless of what you think about these things, they're going to permeate. The only, I think, pushback I would maybe offer is for the folks that are graduating, if they're going to firms and looking for jobs and the leaders at those firms are just now getting clawed, I would run as far away from that job as possible. Meaning, like, I think what you're going to see in a lot of those jobs is those firms are not going to persist. If they're this late to the game, I would be severely concerned that those things are going to be outcompeted. There's always going to be like fringe cases, but think about how many companies you know that are not on the internet right now, right? It's almost zero, right? Or not using email. Those tech had laggards as well. I think the fundamental difference between those technologies and the one that we're living through right now is how transformative and impactful this technology actually can be. So in the same way that the internet put like the yellow pages out of business, we are seeing realistic, I think, reorganizations of business from first principles in AI in ways that haven't been imagined since the internet, right? We're talking about like 20-ish, years, 20, 25 years at this point. And so I do think you're correct in that so long as the young people or the early career professionals making a career transition otherwise know these tools, they're going to be infinitely employable. But the challenge, I guess there's two challenges I see. Number one, in going to work at a firm that's no longer going to exist can be very valuable and transformative in your own learning. So long as you're not anticipating having an entire career there, I don't see any harm in that. But then number two, the rate of change for this technology also provides some caution for getting too hyper-specialized. So we've seen demands of present day be kind of run over in increasingly rapid cycles, on the order of months. The most extreme version of this is folks in the Silicon Valley ecosystem, the bubble, the kind of X ecosystems of the world, claiming AGI was reached in February. I don't know that I would go that far, but the open question of assume we do in the next 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, what version of specialized skills are still valuable feels to me like an unanswerable question at this stage. And I do think that the core skill that young people, especially those coming, into their first job back out of university, need to learn is curiosity and agency. It's not how to do a specific task. It is how to learn what is needed as the technology evolves, because they're going to have to evolve with it over the next handful of years. And even if you think we're on a decade run to AGI, which feels way too long to me, 10 years into a 40 or 50-year career is, barely the first few innings.
Yeah, I think I would just add some thoughts to that, which is that most people do not work for big visible companies. The vast majority of people work for companies way below that waterline of visibility for you or me or anyone at YC. And those jobs, the context wall, the wall that needs to be climbed to have sufficient context to compete, is so high. It is so much higher than most people realize that it doesn't matter if you have way better technology, because they have the incumbency of context and relationships in that industry that it feels to me like if we take the internet analogy of let's say the internet started scaling with any material scale, let's call it mid 90s, and the bubble burst in 2001. I would say I think we're around the 1999 2000 era of this is going to be amazing, and the prevailing sentiment is optimism. I think that's kind of where we are. I think there will be some kind of adjustment of sentiment. It may not, I think the future doesn't rhyme. It doesn't map, but it rhymes with the past. And I would say that there's going to be some kind of reconsideration of that. It may be much more subtle and graceful than the bubble bursting in 2001, but I think there will be some kind of reassessment. But I think in terms of those firms being outcompeted because of technology, I just don't think that that's realistic for the vast majority of under the waterline companies, which are basically all of the companies with 10,000 employees and less, and there's a lot of them. Speaking of big companies, Damon, I wonder what you think of who is in the best position. And I'm just going to read some names to you. I'm curious who stands out as being in really great position, who's in potentially a concerning position. The names I'll read out: Meta, Apple, Google, Amazon, Microsoft.
Yeah. I think that Google and Microsoft occupy similar spaces, and that they have highly profitable businesses that are all legacy, and that they're all trying to transition to the new age. I think that both of those firms also lack sufficient talent in what has kind of become a race for the frontier models. We've seen Microsoft, as an example, decouple from OpenAI. That's to diversify kind of their cloud offering across the various model providers. We've seen both Google and Microsoft try to build their own internal models, both of which not to the kind of Pareto frontier, although people would argue that Gemini is competitive in flashes and tends to cycle behind in things like coding or otherwise, but can be competitive on some vectors. So those to me feel kind of in bucket, I would call it maybe like tier B. Apple's in a tier all to itself because, in my opinion, Apple doesn't have to win a software game to still be a viable player, simply because they own a significant piece of their own hardware stack. So to me, they're almost untouchable by any of the kind of wins of AI. If AI does great, they do great. If AI does poorly, they do poorly. They can always just strike up a deal. They didn't have to win search, as an example, right? They still won the smartphone market, even though they're hyper competitive with Pixel and Android and the various players in that market. They still kind of dominate that market. Similar in PCs, they didn't win PC whole cloth. They didn't win the Microsoft Office suite space, but yet people still use MacBooks in abundant numbers. They also have their service offering, so like their revenue is diversified in ways that make them kind of impermeable. So I think of the options you gave me, I think I would almost rank them second. I'm leaving a very specific place to Amazon, and I'll return there, but I want to take a moment just to focus on Meta, because Meta is interesting in that of all the folks we have kind of, this is almost full circle to our earlier conversation, talked about in struggling to gain ROI from AI specifically, Meta is a standout in that category, in that their ad revenue has recently jumped Google simply because their targeting has improved so much with their use of AI. Now, that hasn't actually come directly from them being able to build their own internal, large language model per se, but everything is downstream of both their own proprietary building of those large language models, their other things like the segment anything models, and also the use of third-party models, right? Whether that be open source or Anthropic's models or OpenAI's models or otherwise. And so they have been a primary beneficiary of the enabling technology that is AI, right? And that's realized to them in better ads. So while I think they have taken a somewhat circuitous path, or they were kind of bolstering the open source to beneficial to them, their core products, the WhatsApps, the Meta, Instagrams, the Facebooks, if you still kind of call that a core business, those kind of things, those are starting to see real significant improvement because of the AI kind of transition. That said, the other thing that we haven't even touched on yet is how, I guess you could call them the market leader in wearables, which also feels like kind of the next iteration for Glass, the kind of Ray-Ban collaboration, that kind of thing. I think they are in prime position to leverage, if there is a platform shift, they will be one of maybe 3 to 4 viable players there, Apple being kind of another notable one, right? Amazon is the one that is the most interesting to me in this entire conversation because they are the one, similar to Google, who have tried to vertically integrate, given that AWS is so much of their stack. They also are the one that, again, like Google, have access to the most unique aspects of consumer behavior and data. So like Meta, they have access to data in ways that other people simply do not. They have order history. We've had Alexa devices living in our homes for going on a decade now. Amazon's a really unique place for basically every part of the stack that I think puts them in a really strong position. That said, the challenge that I see for Amazon specifically is that diffuse focus. I don't see them winning any one thing right now. I just see them being players everywhere. So if I were to rank them kind of in order, and I think I hit every name you said, Amazon would be first, Apple second, Google and Microsoft 3A and 3B in interchangeable order there, and then kind of Meta on the back end, but Meta as being a primary beneficiary of any and all of the above.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. My take on Amazon is I think I inherit a lot of the thoughts that you laid out. And I think Amazon wins as the world's infrastructure and logistics player. They're already open sourcing their physical shipping infrastructure and letting companies build into their shipping stack. And that movement of atoms will just continue to compound in value. And they're already the world's leader in tech infra. I think they could potentially acquire neoclouds when the neoclouds feel like they're stable enough. Amazon can more than bankroll acquisitions like that if and when they make sense. These would be the Nebiuses and CoreWeaves of the world. Amazon's also in a great position to scale up or down based on tokenomics. They simply have the kind of scale that really nobody else does. Google, while Google Cloud competes in that infra space, Google's not focused on it the way that Amazon is, hyper-focused and narrowly focused on it. I see Apple in an incredibly strong position like you. I think Apple has a unique niche that no one with even $100 billion of startup capital today could penetrate and steal material market share from in any near-term window. And that's an incredibly strong moat for them. So I agree with you, Apple's in a great position. Meta, I generally feel like the ethos around Meta is negative, meaning the sentiment of people that I talk to who have worked there or who have personal experiences there just feel like it's soulless. And I just want to highlight that. I think economically they're in a great position in terms of advertising dollars. I just think there's like something about the ethos that may catch up to them ultimately because they've tried to be a frontier model, Llama open source model company, and it hasn't worked. They've tried on the VR front and lost many billions of dollars trying to build a winner there. I think they are trying to be something they aren't in a way, and I think that will ultimately catch up to Meta. I think Google's in a really interesting place, and because they are at the nexus of all of these kind of points on the frontier, they can integrate those different points in a way that maybe nobody else can. And last, I think Microsoft is in the least strong place of these big tech companies, and I think they made their bet on OpenAI early. They put a huge amount of capital there. They later diversified by trying to. Now they serve on Azure, Anthropic models and other open source models. So they've kind of diversified their bet from purely an OpenAI back end to offering multiple models. But I think Microsoft is also in a very difficult position because, let's face it, Microsoft has done well through acquisition, not through organic growth of Windows and selling Microsoft Word licenses. They've done well through acquiring major companies. And incorporating them into the Microsoft umbrella. There's just not that many of those remaining for them to make a material difference at this point. And so I don't know how successful that strategy can be. But last topic for today, Damon, you've done a lot of work in bio, and biomedical engineering. What's your take on peptides? Where peptides are today in the conversation, especially on X, and where do you see it going?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple different things. I think the umbrella peptide term is fairly loaded. So just like grounding the conversation, like peptides are something that are effectively smaller than proteins, right? Which proteins are the largest class of drugs, typically proteins and small molecules. Proteins, when I say large, I don't mean like by volume, I mean largest, like physically large, like large molecules. Small molecules being the small, peptides being kind of somewhere in the middle. Peptides really have gained popularity around the GLP-1s, right? So these kind of Wegovy's, the Ozempics, et cetera. There's a lot of names at this point, a lot of generics. This is where they've really gotten popular. There have been a couple others that have shown what I would consider great anecdotal success, but have still not been perfectly evaluated by the FDA and things. And I think this topic kind of takes on two different vectors of conversation. I think there's a conversation on how do we do approval for drugs in a way that is efficient, properly protects the public from self-experimentation, while also still giving people agency to try the things they want to try. That's bucket one. And then bucket two is are the peptides that we've actually looked at effective, right? And what does actually effective mean? Mm-hmm. And I think that the maybe starting with the former of those two and having kind of an FDA style discussion first, for one, the FDA exists for a reason, right? You can't just let people advertise anything they want. You can't just let people sell potentially harmful chemicals and products that people can put in their body. The fact of the matter is, people on an individual basis can't be responsible for understanding all of the unintended consequences of things in their food, in their drinking water, and in their medicine, right? So you need some level of standards across all of those things, and the FDA provides a real service in that path. That said, the FDA approval process is full of bureaucratic slowdown. It's imperfect, and by virtue of that, some good and even great drugs get missed, right? And so experimenting in some form should be encouraged. I think there's some danger, and we've seen this kind of narrative play out in the supplement space, where what you end up with is, in the least harmful iteration of this, it's people kind of overpaying for expensive urine, right? Where it's just like, I'm putting things in my body that don't actually help my body, but don't really hurt them either. So I'm just being marketed products to, I'm buying, false protein powders or amino acids or whatever, right? I'm taking them. They're not really providing me any benefit, but they're not really harming me either. So the only thing really lost is money, right? And in some cases, the placebo effect there actually outweighs any expense and the benefit. So sometimes that's a good thing. The challenge is some of those supplements are actually harmful. And so people are putting harmful products in their body without understanding fully what they're putting in their body. My fear for peptides is not necessarily the specific peptides themselves. It is that people are undergoing experiments out of rebellion or because of things they're reading on Twitter, which are an X, and which can become increasingly AI driven, right? They think they might be interacting with a real medical professional or a real expert in one of these spaces, a health science expert or otherwise. They might be receiving advice on that kind of false basis, and then they're taking products that are potentially harmful to them. So that's the kind of danger that I see. Not with any specific peptide or the other. I can't comment too specifically around the peptides because, in my opinion, the data doesn't exist yet. We can echo anecdotes, and I think those are important, but the full body of data is still kind of pending. And so I'll just wait until I can see that to actually comment fully on whether, like, retatrutide, as an example, is effective or not effective. Again, it seems great. I mean, I think there's an argument that we should be all microdosing GLP-1s, but the data just simply isn't there to actually say that yet.
Yeah. GLP-1s have certainly been the big story. They're such a big line item now, and healthcare expense and pharma expense. And people are promoting, as you said, various peptides on Twitter. I see all kinds of influencers promoting various peptide stacks, and I'm the kind of person who will only buy from big pharma, but I know that other people are buying these peptides from third parties who are not official pharmas to get access or get lower costs, and who knows what they're getting. To your point, I hope you're right that we have an approval process for these peptides that can go through big pharma and go through reliable production chains that don't put lives at risk, because these are injectables. We are putting putting medicine directly into our bloodstream, into our bodies, that in a way is more direct than the gastric, the by mouth medication. And so we need to be even more careful. But I'm also incredibly optimistic about what science and healthcare is going to do over the next 10 years. These peptides are kind of a window into the next stage of treatment and human health improvement. I'm excited about that. So yeah.
Well, I was going to say, I don't know if you saw or not, but there was another study that was just published in the New England Journal of Medicine from Eli Lilly, not on a peptide, but it was on gene editing therapy, basically that effectively, and again, just reading from the paper that's there, went a long way towards solving high cholesterol.
Yes.
Right, which is a massive burden on not just the U.S. kind of population, but the global kind of chronic illness population. So I agree with you. And again, bringing this conversation full circle, I think AI is an enabling technology, and we look at honestly 5 to 10 companies a week right now that are trying to do something with AI to do novel biology for some health-related application, either gene therapy, new drugs, new types of molecules, even that may not even turn into drugs. They might end up being something else. I don't know, some sort of supplement or something that's kind of tangential to a proper drug. But in any event, I agree with you. Massive optimism around health and longevity.
Yeah, that's a great place to leave it. All right. Thanks for joining us for our Restart Pod. We'll see you next time.